They called him the undefeated, the Alpha King whose banners never fell, whose enemies kneeled or died. But here's the truth no bard will sing. Vaelor Thorne ruled the greatest empire the world had ever known, and not a single soul in it dared to touch him without flinching. Power had made him untouchable. Untouchable had made him alone. And loneliness, left long enough in a man with that much fire, becomes something worse than any wound. It becomes silence. Stay with me until the end of this one. Hit that like. And drop your city in the comments. I want to know where my people are watching from tonight. The storm had teeth. Not the polite kind that rattled shutters and sent servants scurrying for candles. This was the sort of storm that cracked the sky open like a skull, that turned the courtyards of the imperial citadel into rivers of black water and made the ancient stone groan as if it remembered something it wished it could forget. Lightning carved the dark in jagged lines, and for one breath the entire palace compound stood exposed, every tower, every wall, every iron-barred gate, before the darkness swallowed it whole again. Vaelor Thorne stood at the window of his private war chamber, watching the rain punish the world below. He wore no crown, no armor, just a loose linen shirt that did nothing to hide the web of scars crossing his forearms, his collarbone, the side of his throat where a blade had once come close enough to taste his pulse. His jaw was set. His hands rested flat against the stone ledge, and the cold seeped into his palms the way it always did, slowly, steadily, like a companion that never left. Behind him, the fire crackled low. He did not turn when the door opened. "You should be sleeping." Commander Drake Ashvane's voice came rough and unhurried, the way a man speaks when he has spent 30 years in service and no longer pretends that rank changes anything between friends. He stepped inside, rain still dripping from his cloak, and surveyed the room with the practiced eye of a soldier who checks exits before he checks faces. "Council session starts at dawn. Lucien's already positioning his people." "Lucien is always positioning his people." Vaelor's voice was low, the kind of quiet that fills a room not because it demands attention, but because everything else instinctively makes space for it. He did not look away from the storm. What does he want this time? Same thing he always wants. Your ear, your trust, your blind spot. Drake moved to the fire, extending his hands toward the heat with a grunt. The scars on his knuckles caught the light, old scars, earned in wars that most of the current court had only read about in dispatches. He's been meeting with Duke Malrek Voss 3 times this week. Closed doors, no scribes. Malrek. The name left Vaelor's mouth like something scraped off the bottom of a boot. The man smiles too much for someone who controls half the southern trade routes. Smiles because nobody's looked under those trade routes yet. Drake turned, his expression hard beneath the weathered lines of his face. "I'm telling you, Vaelor, something stinks in the southern provinces. The reports coming out of Voss's territories, missing Omegas, entire families relocated with no documentation, villages going quiet in ways that don't match famine or plague. You have proof. I have patterns and dead ends. Every time my people get close, the trail vanishes. Witnesses go silent. Documents burn." Drake paused, and something shifted behind his eyes. The kind of frustration that sits bone deep in men who have spent their lives protecting a system they are beginning to suspect might be rotten from the inside. Someone is cleaning up, and they're doing it with resources only a High Lord could command. Vaelor finally turned from the window. The firelight found his face and made the scar along his left cheekbone look deeper than it was. A souvenir from the siege of Karen, where he had held a collapsing wall with nothing but his shoulder and a refusal to die that the surviving soldiers still talked about when they thought he could not hear. His eyes were pale gray, almost colorless, and they carried the particular emptiness of a man who had learned long ago that victory and peace are not the same thing. "Bring it to council. Lucien will bury it. Then I will dig it up." Drake studied him for a long moment. "You look like hell." "I always look like hell." "No, you always look dangerous. Tonight you look tired." Drake's voice dropped, losing its military edge and finding something older, something that existed between them long before titles and thrones. "When was the last time you slept through a night?" Vaelor did not answer. He turned back to the window, and the silence that filled the gap was answer enough. Outside, the storm raged on, indifferent to kings and commanders and the small, stubborn acts of men trying to hold an empire together with nothing but discipline and will. Go get some rest, Drake. That in order. That's a suggestion from a man who's about to stand in this window until the storm either quits or takes the whole damn citadel down. Drake shook his head but moved toward the door. He paused with his hand on the iron latch. Whatever Lucian's planning, it's accelerating. I can feel it. And I've been wrong about a lot of things in my life, but I have never been wrong about the smell of a betrayal cooking. The door closed behind him. Vaelor stood alone. The fire hissed and popped. Rain hammered the glass. And somewhere deep in the bones of the citadel, in the hidden corridors and sealed passages that honeycombed the ancient stone, something was moving. He did not know it yet, but the storm had already brought what it came to bring. The alarm came an hour before dawn. Not the great war horns that signaled invasion, not the bronze bells that announced fire. This was a different sound. The sharp clipped whistle of a perimeter sentry reporting a breach, followed by the muffled commotion of guards converging on a location that should have been impossible to reach. The king's private garden. Vaelor was already moving before the second whistle, pulling on boots and buckling a short blade to his hip with the automatic efficiency of a man whose body had been trained to respond to threat before his mind finished processing it. He took the interior stairs 3 at a time, his scarred hands gripping the cold stone rail, and emerged into the colonnade that overlooked the walled garden just as 2 sentries dragged something out of the hedgerow. Not something. Someone. A woman. She was small, not fragile but compact in the way that spoke of a body that had learned to make itself as little a target as possible. Her clothes were torn and soaked through, plastered to skin that was more bruised than flesh. Blood ran from a gash above her left eyebrow and mixed with the rain on her face in thin pink rivers. Her hands were bound in front of her with a crude rope that had bitten deep enough to leave raw welts, and she was shaking. Not the theatrical trembling of fear performed for an audience, but the deep involuntary shuddering of a body that had been pushed past every limit it had and was now running on nothing but the animal refusal to stop. Her scent hit him before her face registered. Omega. Not the delicate, curated scent of the court Omegas who moved through the palace in silk and careful submission. This was raw, wounded. A scent like iron and wildflowers crushed underfoot, threaded with the sharp chemical edge of terror and something else, something fierce and unbroken that had no business existing in a body that battered. The sentries hauled her upright. She swayed, her legs buckling, and for one moment her eyes found his across the rain-slicked colonnade. Dark eyes, almost black, and in them, not the plea he expected, not the desperate supplication of a fugitive caught inside the most heavily guarded fortress in the empire. What he saw was assessment. Cold, rapid, unflinching assessment. The look of someone cataloging threats, calculating odds, deciding in a fraction of a heartbeat whether the man standing above her was salvation or just another form of death. "Found her in the East Hedge, Majesty," the lead sentry reported, his voice tight with the particular anxiety of a soldier who has discovered a breach he cannot explain. "No idea how she got past the outer wall. No idea how she got past the second perimeter. She was just there, bleeding into the roses. She say anything. Hasn't spoken a word, tried to bite Corporal Hennon when he grabbed her arm." Vaelor descended the stairs slowly. The rain hit his face and ran down the scar tissue on his neck, and he did not flinch. He stopped 3 paces from the woman and looked at her with the same deliberate attention he gave battlefield terrain, reading the wounds, the rope burns, the pattern of bruises that told a story uglier than any she might speak aloud. Someone had beaten her, systematically. The bruises were layered, old yellows beneath fresh purples, a timeline of sustained violence written on her body like a ledger. "Cut the rope," he said. The sentries hesitated. "I said cut it." A blade flashed. The rope fell away. The woman's hands dropped to her sides, and she sucked in a breath that was half gasp, half sob. The involuntary sound of a body experiencing the absence of pain for the first time in long enough that it had forgotten the feeling existed. She still did not speak. "What is your name?" Vaelor's voice carried no softness, no pity. Pity was a luxury that men in his position could not afford without it being mistaken for weakness. And weakness in the imperial citadel was an invitation to be devoured. But there was something in the way he asked, a directness that bypassed the usual layers of court protocol and addressed her as what she was, a person, standing in a storm, bleeding. She looked at him. Rain ran between them. The sentries shifted uneasily, their hands on their weapons, their eyes darting between the unknown Omega and the king who was treating her breach of the most secure compound in the Empire as if it were nothing more than an unexpected knock at the door. Seraphine. Her voice came out wrecked, hoarse, raw, scraped down to something barely above a whisper, but the word itself was steady. Seraphine Vael. Who did this to you? Her eyes flickered, not with fear, with calculation. She was deciding how much to say, how much he could be trusted with, how much truth a king could stomach before he decided it was easier to look away. People you sit at dinner with, she said. People who pour your wine and call you majesty and go home at night to count the bodies they've buried. The silence that followed was sharp enough to cut. One of the sentries stepped forward. Majesty, protocol requires that any unauthorized intrusion. I know what protocol requires. Vaelor did not raise his voice. He never needed to. Get a physician. Get dry clothes. Put her in the East Wing guest quarters. The East Wing? The sentry's eyes widened. Majesty, that's the secured corridor under my direct authority. Yes, I am aware of the layout of my own citadel. His gaze did not leave the woman. She stays under my protection until I decide otherwise. No one speaks to her without my presence. No one enters that corridor without my seal. Is that clear? Yes, Majesty. Then move. The sentries moved. Seraphine Vael stood in the rain for one more moment, swaying on legs that should have collapsed long ago, and looked at the king with those dark, assessing eyes. You don't know what you just did, she said quietly. I gave a wounded person shelter. You just made yourself a target. Something almost imperceptible shifted in Vaelor's expression. Not surprise, not fear. Something closer to recognition. The look of a man who has been a target for so long that the addition of one more crossbow barely registers. I've been a target since the day I was born, he said. Get inside before you bleed to death in my garden. She moved. Not quickly. Her body would not allow quick, but with a deliberate, grinding determination that turned every step into an act of defiance against the damage that had been done to her. She passed within arm's reach of him, and her scent hit him again, iron and crushed wildflowers and that fierce, impossible thread of something unbroken, and he felt it land somewhere behind his ribs like a fist. He stood in the rain after she was gone, stood there until the water soaked through his shirt and the cold reached his bones and the fire in his chest that her scent had ignited did not go out. Morning came like a blade. The council chamber occupied the heart of the imperial palace, a vast hall of black marble and iron columns where the words spoken decided the fates of millions. 27 seats arranged in a tiered semicircle, each one representing a noble house powerful enough to make war or peace with a single vote. At the center, elevated above the rest, sat the throne. Not the gilded monstrosity that foreign ambassadors expected, but a stark chair of dark iron that looked exactly like what it was. A seat built for a man who ruled through force and had never pretended otherwise. Vaelor entered the chamber wearing full formal armor, not ceremonial, functional. Battle-grade steel with the scratches and dents of actual combat still visible on the surface. It was a message he delivered without words every time he walked into this room. I did not inherit this empire. I bled for it, and I will bleed for it again before I let any of you forget that. Crown Regent Vaelor Thorne was already seated. He occupied the advisory chair to the right of the throne, a position he had held for 11 years and wielded with the quiet, relentless precision of a man who understood that real power rarely needed to sit on the actual throne. He was impeccably dressed, silk coat, silver cuffs, not a single hair displaced from the careful architecture of his appearance. His face was handsome in the way that well-maintained masks are handsome. Symmetrical, pleasant, revealing absolutely nothing. Cousin, Lucien said, his voice carrying the warm tone of a man who had perfected the art of sounding sincere. "The storm kept you up, I trust." "The storm was the least of it." Vaelor took his seat. The iron was cold against his back. He surveyed the room, the gathered lords and ladies of the council, their faces arranged in the careful neutrality that passed for politics in Varenth. Some of them were allies, some were enemies. Most were whatever served their interests on any given morning. "We have matters to discuss before the formal agenda." Vaelor did not allow the usual preamble. "Commander Ashvane has brought irregularities in the southern provinces to my attention. Missing persons, undocumented relocations. I want a formal investigation authorized." The chamber went quiet. Not the productive quiet of minds considering a proposal. The tense, held breath quiet of people who already know what is being discussed and do not want it discussed. Duke Malrek Voss shifted in his seat. He was a thick man, not fat, but dense, built like a wall designed to absorb impact and remain standing. His smile was firmly in place, the kind of smile that never quite reached his pale blue eyes. "Missing persons, Your Majesty, in the southern provinces. Forgive me, but the South has always been fluid. People move. Villages shift. The harvest cycles alone account for significant population movement." "Population movement doesn't explain families vanishing without documentation," Drake said from his position at the base of the throne platform. He stood, because he always stood. A seated soldier, he had once told Vaelor, is a soldier halfway to dead. It doesn't explain witnesses going silent, and it doesn't explain why every investigation my people launch into your territories hits a dead end within a week. Malrek's smile did not waver. "Commander Ashvane, your dedication to thoroughness is admirable, but I would caution against conflating coincidence with conspiracy. The southern provinces are vast. Administrative gaps are unfortunate but hardly unusual." "Administrative gaps?" Drake's voice was flat. "Is that what we're calling it?" "Gentlemen?" Lucien's voice cut through the exchange with the practiced ease of a man who had been mediating, or manipulating, council disputes for over a decade. "I think what Duke Voss is suggesting is that a formal investigation is a serious step, one that carries implications for the sovereignty of individual territories. Perhaps a preliminary audit would be more appropriate, less disruptive, less accusatory." Vaelor looked at his cousin, studied the careful arrangement of his expression, the measured concern, the subtle redirect that transformed a demand for answers into a suggestion for delay. "A preliminary audit," Vaelor repeated, "conducted jointly by the Council's Oversight Committee and the provincial administrators. Transparent, thorough, and respectful of the autonomy that our noble houses have upheld for generations. The autonomy that allows a duke to move people through his territory without documentation." Lucian's expression flickered, just once, just barely, before the mask resettled. "The autonomy that holds this empire together, cousin. The great houses support the crown because the crown respects their governance. Undermine that, and you do not merely investigate a duke. You threaten the foundation of Varenth itself." It was beautifully done. Vaelor could almost admire the craftsmanship of it. The way Lucien had taken a question about missing people and transformed it into a question about imperial stability had shifted the weight of the conversation from the guilty to the accuser, and made anyone who pushed further look like the one threatening the empire. He had seen Lucien do this 100 times, 1,000, and every time it worked, because Lucien understood something that most people in this chamber would never admit. That power in Varenth did not belong to the man on the throne. It belonged to the man who controlled what the man on the throne was allowed to see. "Fine," Vaelor said. "A preliminary audit. But Drake's people lead it, not the provincial administrators." "Of course." Lucien inclined his head with the perfect degree of deference. "Transparency is paramount." The session continued. Trade disputes, border reports, the endless machinery of empire grinding forward. Vaelor sat through it with the iron discipline that 30 years of rule had forged into his spine, and behind his pale eyes, his mind worked in ways that no one in this chamber could see. Seraphine Vail's words circled in his skull like wolves. "People you sit at dinner with." He ended the session early, The council dispersed in murmuring clusters, alliances being reinforced, gossip being traded, the invisible architecture of court politics rebuilding itself the moment the formal structure dissolved. Vaelor descended from the throne platform and caught Drake's eye. "My chambers. 1 hour." Drake nodded. Lucienne intercepted him in the corridor. "A moment, cousin." The crown regent fell into step beside him, matching his pace with the easy grace of a man who had spent a lifetime walking in another man's shadow and making it look voluntary. "I wanted to discuss a matter of some delicacy." "You always want to discuss matters of some delicacy." "I understand a woman was brought into the citadel last night. An Omega, found in your private garden." Lucien's voice carried no judgment, no accusation, just the careful neutrality of a man laying groundwork. "Placed in the east wing, under your personal seal." Vaelor stopped walking. "That happened 4 hours ago." "How do you already know about it?" Lucien smiled, and there it was again. The mask, the warmth, the practiced sincerity that hid everything behind a surface so polished it reflected the viewer's own expectations back at them. "I make it my business to know what happens inside these walls, cousin. It is, after all, my responsibility to protect you, even from your own generosity." She was wounded. She needed shelter. "And you gave it, because that is who you are, the king who cannot turn away from a wounded creature." Something moved beneath Lucien's surface, something cold and calculating that he allowed to flash for just an instant before burying it again. "But you must consider how this looks. An unknown Omega, in the king's private quarters, under his personal seal, with no documented origin, no sponsor, no identity that can be verified. The court will talk." "The court always talks." "The court talks, and then the court acts. You have enemies, Vaelor, men who would use any lever to challenge your authority. A mysterious Omega appearing inside the most secure compound in the Empire. That is not just gossip. That is a weapon waiting to be loaded." Vaelor met his cousin's eyes, held them, searched for whatever lived behind that impeccable facade, and found, as always, nothing but his own reflection staring back. "I appreciate your concern, Lucien. But you will do as you see fit." "I will do what is right. Those are not always the same thing as what is fit." Lucien held his gaze for 1 beat, 2. Then he inclined his head with that same perfect deference and stepped aside. "Of course, Majesty. I only counsel caution." He watched his cousin walk away, and the thing that settled in his chest was not anger, not suspicion. It was the cold, quiet recognition that Lucien had known about Seraphine before the council session began and had said nothing. Had sat through the entire discussion of southern disappearances, of missing Omegas, of undocumented relocations, and had not connected, or had chosen not to connect, the arrival of a battered Omega in the king's garden with the very crimes being debated. Either Lucien was not as intelligent as he appeared, or he already knew exactly who Seraphine Vael was. Vaelor found her awake. The East Wing guest quarters were austere by palace standards. Stone walls, a single fireplace, a bed with clean linens, and windows that overlooked an interior courtyard where no one could approach without being seen. The physician had come and gone, leaving behind bandaged ribs, a stitched eyebrow, and a report that detailed injuries consistent with prolonged captivity and repeated physical assault. Seraphine sat on the edge of the bed, with her knees drawn up and her back against the headboard. She had been given clean clothes, a simple tunic and trousers, nothing that marked her as court or common, and she wore them with the self-conscious stiffness of someone who had forgotten what clean fabric felt like against skin. The bruises on her arms were turning yellow at the edges. She looked up when he entered, that same assessing gaze, that same rapid calculation. But something in it had shifted, not softened, but recalibrated, as if the fact that she had survived the night without chains or interrogation had adjusted her threat matrix in ways she was still processing. "I need to know who you are," Vaelor said. No preamble, no courtesy. The frontier register of a man who had spent more of his life on battlefields than in ballrooms. "I need to know who did this to you, and I need to know how the hell you got inside a fortress that 3 armies failed to breach. One question at a time, or do you want the whole disaster in a single pour?" He almost smiled, did not, but something in his expression cracked just enough for the light to change. Start with the disaster. Seraphine's hands tightened on her knees. The knuckles went white. She took a breath that cost her something. He could see it in the way her jaw clenched, the way her bruised ribs protested, and she overrode the pain with the same grinding willpower that had carried her through the storm and into his garden. My name is Seraphine Vael. I was born in the Eastern Territories, trained as a records clerk for the Provincial Trade Commission. 2 years ago, I was taken. She did not flinch on the word, did not dress it up or soften it. Taken, like an object removed from a shelf. Duke Malrek Voss runs a network, not trade. People. Omegas, mostly. Some betas. Anyone vulnerable enough to disappear without questions. Vaelor's hands curled into fists at his sides. Slowly, the tendons in his forearms stood out like cables. Trafficking. Organized, systematic, protected. Her voice did not waver, but her eyes went dark in a way that had nothing to do with their color. Dark, the way a well goes dark when you drop a stone and never hear it hit bottom. They move people through the southern provinces using Voss's trade routes. Legitimate cargo on top, human cargo underneath. The documentation is buried in layers of shell companies and false permits that would take years to unravel if you were looking. And nobody has been looking. Someone has been looking. My commander. Your commander has been hitting walls because those walls are built by people inside your own palace. She said it flat. No drama. No accusation. Just the cold delivery of a fact that had cost her everything to learn. The network doesn't work without protection at the highest levels. Trade inspectors who look the other way. Judges who dismiss cases. Council members who table investigations before they gain traction. You're saying the council is compromised. I'm saying the Arat goes higher than the council. The implication landed in the room like a blade driven into a table. Vaelor stared at her. She stared back. And in the space between them, something was being built. Not trust, not yet. Trust was a luxury neither of them could afford. But the beginning of an understanding. Two people looking at the same darkness and refusing to pretend it was not there. You said you were a records clerk. How did you get out? Because they made a mistake. They kept records, too. A ghost of something fierce crossed her face. Not a smile, but the shape of one, the skeleton of defiance wearing the skin of exhaustion. I spent 18 months memorizing every document I could access. Names, dates, routes, transaction codes. Then I ran and ended up inside my citadel, the underground passages, the old ones from the siege era. Most of them are collapsed, not all. She met his eyes. I did not come here by accident, Your Majesty. I came here because you are the only person in this empire with the power to stop what is happening. And because every other door I tried was already owned by the people doing it. The fire crackled. Rain still fell outside, lighter now, the storm spending itself. Vaelor stood in the center of the room, looking at this woman, this battered, bruised, fierce, impossible woman who had crawled through collapsed tunnels and bled through a storm to deliver a truth that could shatter his empire. And he felt something shift inside him. Not the bond. Not yet. Something older than that. Something more fundamental. The recognition that the empire he had built, the empire he had bled for and broken himself to hold together, was rotting from the inside. And the person who had come to tell him was not a general or a spy or a political operative. It was an Omega who had been treated like cargo and had refused to stay in the hold. The names, he said. How many can you give me? Enough to burn down everything Malrek Voss has built, and enough to make whoever is protecting him very, very desperate to make sure I never speak. Then we need to move fast. You need to move carefully. She leaned forward, and the intensity in her dark eyes was almost physical, a force that pushed against the air between them. Because the person protecting Voss is someone you trust, someone close to you, someone who has been shaping what you see and what you don't see for years. And when they find out I'm here, when they find out what I know, they will not send soldiers. What will they send? A reason. A perfectly crafted, beautifully logical reason for you to hand me over. And it will sound right. It will feel right. And every instinct you have will tell you to listen. Her voice dropped. That is how they work. Not with swords, with whispers. The rain outside had stopped. The silence that replaced it was louder than the storm. Vaelor looked at Seraphine Vale, looked past the bruises and the bandages and the wrecked voice and the torn-down body, and saw what lived underneath all of it. Not fragility, not submission, not the careful deference that the Empire demanded from every Omega who drew breath within its borders. He saw a woman who had walked through the worst thing human beings could do to another human being and had come out the other side carrying evidence instead of surrender. "No one is handing you anywhere," he said. "You have my word." The word of a king. The word of a man. He paused. Those are not always the same thing, but tonight they are. She held his gaze, searching, testing, looking for the crack in the promise, the hidden clause, the escape hatch that men in power always built into their commitments. She did not find one. "Then we start tomorrow," she said. "We start now." He turned toward the door, stopped, looked back at her one more time, and the firelight caught the scars on his face and the scars on her arms, and for one silent moment they were just two damaged people standing on opposite sides of a room that was not big enough to hold everything that was coming. "Get some rest," he said. "You're going to need it." "So are you, Your Majesty." "Vaelor." She blinked. The first genuine surprise he had seen on her face since she had fallen out of his hedgerow, bleeding and half dead. "Rest well." "Vaelor." He left the room, closed the door, stood in the corridor with his back against the cold stone and his pulse hammering in his ears and the scent of iron and crushed wildflowers still burning in his lungs. Down the corridor a shadow moved. Vaelor's hand went to his blade, but the shadow was already gone, slipping around a corner, moving with the practiced silence of someone who had been listening, someone who had heard enough. And as the last of the storm drained from the sky and the palace settled into the uneasy quiet that passes for peace, in a court built on secrets, a sealed message was already making its way through the dark passages of the citadel, past the sentries, past the locked doors, past every safeguard a king could build. The message reached Crown Regent Vaelor Thorne before dawn. It contained 2 words. She talked. Lucien read the message by candlelight, 2 words on a strip of parchment so thin it could be swallowed in a single breath, and he held it between his fingers the way a surgeon holds a blade, steady, precise, with full knowledge of exactly how much damage the next movement could inflict. The candle flame caught the edge of the paper and turned it amber. He did not burn it. Not yet. He folded it once, slid it beneath the ledger on his desk, and sat back in his chair with his hand steepled against his lips. She talked. The question was not what she had said. The question was how much Vaelor believed. Lucien closed his eyes. Behind the darkness of his lids, he assembled the situation the way a general assembles troops on a map. Every piece accounted for, every angle measured, every contingency already branching into 3 more contingencies. This was not panic. Panic was a failure of imagination, and Lucien Thorne had never suffered from a lack of imagination. This was recalibration. The game had not changed. A new piece had entered the board, and pieces could be captured, repositioned, or sacrificed. He opened his eyes and pulled the bell cord. 30 seconds later, his private secretary appeared in the doorway, a thin, colorless man named Adarin, whose greatest talent was the ability to be present without being noticed, and to forget, on command, anything he had been asked to arrange. "Send word to Duke Voss, secure channel. Tell him the merchandise he lost has surfaced inside the citadel, and the king is holding it personally." Lucien's voice carried no urgency, no heat, just the measured cadence of a man issuing instructions for something no more alarming than a schedule adjustment. "Then arrange a private meeting with Lord Saren and Lady Caleth, separately, before midday, and make sure it looks like their idea." "Yes, Regent." "One more thing. The East Wing. Who is on rotation?" "Sergeant Bren's unit, sir." "Replace 2 of them. Use Haldrick and Morath. Men who understand that their loyalty to the crown flows through my office before it reaches the throne." Adarin did not blink, did not hesitate, did not ask why. He inclined his head and vanished the way he always vanished, like smoke through a keyhole. Lucien sat alone in the candlelight and thought about his cousin. The tragedy of Vaelor Thorne was not that he was weak, it was that he was strong in all the wrong ways. Strong enough to hold a collapsing wall at Karen, strong enough to break enemy lines with nothing but a short blade and the kind of fury that turns a man into a force of nature. But strength on a battlefield and strength in a palace were different animals entirely, and Vaelor had never learned to tell them apart. He believed that courage meant facing threats head-on. He believed that honesty was a form of power. He believed that the world could be made better by the sheer force of a good man's will. Lucien knew better. The world did not bend for good men. It ate them, and it used their goodness as seasoning. Dawn broke gray and damp over the citadel. The storm had moved east, leaving behind air that tasted of wet stone and the particular heaviness that settles over a city when the sky cannot decide whether it is finished punishing the ground. Vaelor had not slept. He stood in the war chamber with Drake, and between them on the table lay a map of the southern provinces covered in marks that Drake had spent the last 3 hours placing. Red for confirmed disappearances, black for dead-end investigations, yellow for locations where witnesses had gone silent. The pattern was ugly. Dense clusters along Voss's primary trade routes, thinning at the borders where other lords' territories began, disappearing entirely in the regions closest to the capital. She gave me names, Vaelor said. 4 trade inspectors, 2 provincial judges, a harbor master in Veldrin, and a records administrator inside the palace treasury. Drake's jaw tightened. Inside the treasury. Someone has been burying financial trails from this end. The money flows through Voss's territories, but the paperwork that makes it invisible originates here, in the capital. How deep does she say it goes? Deeper than the council. She says the network has protection at the highest levels, someone who controls what reaches my desk and what gets buried before it gets there. Drake looked up from the map. His eyes were hard, and in them Vaelor saw the same cold arithmetic he had seen on battlefields. The calculation of a man measuring whether the fight ahead is survivable and deciding to fight it anyway. You're talking about Lucien. She didn't say his name. She didn't need to. You and I both know there are exactly 3 people in this empire who control what information reaches the throne. You, me, and your cousin. Drake planted his fists on the table. Vaelor, I have been watching that man for 11 years. I have watched him redirect every investigation, table every inquiry, and charm every council member who gets too close to asking the right questions. I have never been able to prove it, but my gut has been screaming since the day he took the regency, and my gut has kept me alive through 6 wars. Your gut is not evidence. No. But that woman in the East Wing might be. Drake straightened. Let me interview her formally. Full debrief. Get every name, every route, every document reference she can recall. We build the case from the ground up, and we move before Lucien can... Before Lucien can what? The voice came from the doorway, and both men turned. Lucien stood at the threshold with his hands clasped behind his back and a look of mild concern arranged across his features like fine tableware set for guests. He stepped inside without waiting for invitation, a habit he had cultivated so carefully over the years that it no longer registered as presumption but as familiarity, as the natural ease of family. Forgive the intrusion. I heard raised voices and thought perhaps I could be of assistance. You didn't hear raised voices, Drakey said flatly. These walls are 3 feet of solid stone. Then perhaps I have excellent hearing. Lucien smiled and moved to the table, his gaze drifting across the map with its clusters of red and black and yellow. He studied it for exactly long enough to appear interested without appearing alarmed. The southern provinces again. You are persistent, Commander. People are missing, Regent. Persistence seems appropriate. Indeed it does. Lucien turned to Vaelor. Cousin, I came to discuss the matter of our guest, the Omega. I have taken the liberty of making some inquiries about her identity. Vaelor's expression did not change, but something behind his eyes went still, the particular stillness of a predator that has detected movement in the brush and is deciding whether it is prey or threat. What kind of inquiries? Discreet ones, as is my duty. Lucien produced a folded document from inside his coat, the movement smooth, rehearsed, a magician revealing a card he had palmed long before the trick began. Seraphine Vael, Born in the Eastern Territories, as she claims. Trained as a records clerk, as she claims. But her employment records end abruptly 2 years ago, and the circumstances surrounding her disappearance are complicated. He placed the document on the table. She was dismissed from the Provincial Trade Commission for falsifying records. There were allegations of theft, embezzlement. The case was settled quietly because the amounts were small and the commission preferred to avoid public embarrassment. Lucian's voice carried the weight of reluctant disclosure, the tone of a man who wished he did not have to deliver bad news, but whose conscience would not permit silence. I do not question her suffering. The injuries are real, but her credibility as a witness, that is another matter entirely. Drake snatched the document off the table and scanned it. His eyes moved fast, and Vaelor watched the muscles in his jaw work as he processed what he was reading. "This is convenient," Drake said. "It is documented." "It is convenient documentation that appeared overnight about a woman who arrived 12 hours ago. Are you suggesting I fabricated it?" "I am suggesting that documents can be manufactured by anyone with access to provincial records and the motivation to discredit a witness." Lucien turned to Vaelor. His expression shifted, not dramatically, not enough for anyone who was not looking for it to notice, but the warmth dimmed by a fraction, and what remained underneath was harder, colder, more honest than anything that usually lived on the surface. "Vaelor, I am your cousin. I have served you for 11 years. I have no interest in discrediting anyone. I have an interest in protecting you from someone who may not be what she appears." He paused, and his voice dropped to something that almost passed for genuine concern. "An unknown Omega appears inside your citadel, carrying accusations against one of the Empire's most powerful lords. She tells you exactly what you want to hear, that there is a conspiracy, that there are villains, that the system you have always suspected of being corrupt is in fact corrupt. And you want to believe her, because it confirms what you already feel. But feelings are not evidence, cousin. And a king who acts on feelings rather than facts does not remain a king for long." The silence that followed was the kind that has weight, physical weight, the kind that presses on the chest and makes breathing a conscious decision rather than an automatic one. Vaelor looked at the document on the table, looked at Drake, looked at Lucien. 3 realities, 3 versions of the truth. And the worst part, the part that sat in his chest like a stone swallowed whole, was that Lucien was not wrong, not entirely. Feelings were not evidence. The desire to believe did not make something believable. And the history of kings who trusted the wrong person was long and bloody and full of lessons that no one ever seemed to learn until it was too late. "Leave the document," Vaelor said. "I will review it." "Of course," Lucien inclined his head. That perfect deference. That immaculate submission to authority that somehow always managed to feel like the authority was being managed rather than served. "I trust your judgment, cousin. I always have." He left. The door closed. Drake exhaled through his teeth. "That man is a snake wrapped in silk, and I'm running out of patience watching him coil." The document could be real, could be forged. There's no way to verify it without sending someone to the Eastern Territories, which would take weeks and give Lucien exactly the delay he needs. Drake tossed the paper back on the table. "He's boxing us in. If we trust her, he discredits her. If we investigate her claims, he buries the evidence while we wait. If we move against Voss, he rallies the council around territorial sovereignty and makes us look like tyrants. Then we do something he does not expect." Drake looked at him. "Such as?" "We let him think it's working." Something shifted in Drake's expression, the hard lines around his mouth loosening just enough to allow the ghost of something that might, in better light, have been called a grin. "You want to play his game. I want to let him play his game, while we play ours." Vaelor gathered the map from the table and rolled it tight. "Tell no one what she told us. Continue the official audit as Lucien proposed. Visible, transparent, exactly what the council expects. But underneath it, I want your most trusted people, not palace staff, not anyone who reports through official channels, running a shadow investigation. Follow the money, find the roots, and find out who inside the citadel is feeding information to Lucien. The spy in the corridor last night." "Yes." That narrows it to anyone with access to the East Wing, which Lucien just made easier for himself by rotating his own people into the guard detail. Vaelor's eyes went flat. He did what? 2 replacements on the East Wing rotation this morning, Haldrick and Morath, both recruited by the Regent's office. The air in the room changed. Not temperature, not light, something else. The quality of silence that precedes a decision that cannot be undone. Vaelor stood very still, and Drakey watched the calculations happen behind his king's eyes, and knew, from 30 years of standing beside this man, that what was forming was not rage. Rage was loud. Rage was wasteful. What Vaelor Thorne did when the walls started closing was something quieter and far more dangerous. He got precise. Pull them. Replace them with veterans from the Karen campaign. Men who answer to you and me and no one else. Do it now. Do it openly. Let Lucien see that I noticed. That tips our hand. No, that tells him I'm paying attention. There is a difference. Vaelor moved toward the door. He wants me to doubt her. He wants me isolated, uncertain, making decisions based on the information he feeds me. That has been his strategy for 11 years. The only thing that has changed is that now I know it. He paused in the doorway, turned, and the look on his face was something Drake had not seen in a long time, longer than he could remember. Not the cold mask of the king, not the exhausted isolation of the man beneath it, something raw, something that carried the particular intensity of a person who has just realized that the cage they have been living in was built by someone they trusted, and who is now deciding bone by bone, muscle by muscle, that the cage will not hold. Keep her safe, Drake, whatever it takes. She's that important. What she knows is that important. Drake held his gaze. Is that the only reason? Vaelor did not answer. He did not need to. Vaelor went to the East Wing. He found Seraphine standing at the window, watching the interior courtyard with the alert stillness of an animal that has learned to track movement in every direction at once. She turned when he entered, and he saw that she had not slept either. The shadows under her eyes were darker, the lines around her mouth deeper, and her bandaged hands gripped the windowsill with a tension that spoke of a body braced for impact. "Your cousin came to see me," she said before he could speak. He stopped. "When?" "An hour ago, while you were in your war room." She released the windowsill and faced him fully. He was very polite, very concerned. He asked how I was feeling. He asked if I needed anything. And then he told me, very gently, very kindly, that the king is a good man but a trusting one, and that people who take advantage of that trust tend to find themselves facing consequences that the king's goodness cannot prevent. He threatened you. He measured me. Threats come later. First, he needed to see what I would do. Whether I would flinch, whether I would run, whether I would go to you and repeat what he said. Her eyes were steady, unblinking. I am telling you because you need to know exactly how he operates, not because I flinched. What did you say to him? I thanked him for his concern. I told him the king's hospitality was more than I deserved. I smiled. I played the grateful, fragile Omega who knows her place and is just so thankful for the kindness of powerful men. Something hard and bright flashed behind her eyes, a blade being drawn from a sheath. It is the role they built for us. It is the role I have been performing for 2 years inside a cage. The difference is that now I am choosing to perform it, and I am choosing who sees behind the curtain. Vaelor crossed the room, slowly, not because he was hesitant, but because the space between them had become charged with something that demanded respect. The kind of invisible boundary that exists between 2 people who are becoming important to each other and are both terrified of what that means. I need to ask you something, and I need you to answer me without strategy, without performance, without deciding what I can handle. Ask. Lucien produced a document, employment records from the Eastern Trade Commission. It says you were dismissed for falsifying records and embezzlement. He watched her face, watched for the flinch, the flash of guilt, the fractional hesitation that would tell him the document had teeth. What he saw was recognition. The weary, unsurprised recognition of someone who had known this was coming. Of course he did. She sat on the edge of the bed, not collapsing, settling, planting herself. The dismissal is real. The charges were fabricated. When I started noticing discrepancies in the trade records, shipments that didn't match cargo manifests, revenue that appeared from routes with no documented goods, I flagged them to my supervisor. 3 weeks later, I was accused of the very crimes I had reported. The evidence against me was manufactured using the same system I had been trying to expose. Can you prove that? I can prove that the falsified records used to build the embezzlement case were created after my termination date. The metadata is embedded in the Commission's filing system. If the original archives still exist, if they haven't been destroyed, the timestamps will show that the evidence was backdated. That is a very specific claim. I am a very specific person. She looked up at him. Vaelor, you are going to have to decide who you believe, not today, not based on one document or one conversation, but soon, because the moment your cousin realizes that discrediting me is not enough, he will move to the next option, and the next option is not a document. The next option is a body. She did not say it. She did not need to. Vaelor stood in the gray morning light of the East Wing, looking at a woman who had survived things that would have broken most people and had emerged not unbroken, but reassembled, held together by will and fury and the stubborn, irrational refusal to let the people who had destroyed her life have the last word. I believe you, he said. Not because of evidence, not because of logic, because of the thing living in her eyes that no amount of fabrication could manufacture. The raw, ground-down, bone-deep honesty of someone who has already lost everything and has nothing left to protect except the truth. It was, he knew, exactly the kind of decision Lucien had warned him against, and it was exactly the kind of decision that separated the man he was from the king they expected him to be. Then you need to know one more thing, Seraphine said. Something I held back last night because I needed to see whether you were real. Tell me. The network, Voss's operation, it has a financial architecture, shell companies, false permits, laundered revenue. All of it flows through a single clearinghouse, a set of accounts buried so deep in the imperial treasury that only someone with the regent's seal could have created them. The room went silent. I memorized the account codes, she said, all 17 of them. Vaelor did not move, did not breathe. The implications of what she had just said expanded outward like cracks spreading through ice, each one leading to the next, each one widening the fracture until the entire surface was a heartbeat away from collapse. 17 accounts, the regent's seal, a financial trail that led not to a duke in the southern provinces, but to the man who sat at the king's right hand and whispered in his ear. Somewhere in the palace, a bell rang for midday, and Vaelor Thorne understood with the cold clarity of a man stepping off a cliff that the empire he thought he ruled had been ruling him. There was no going back from knowing that. There had never been a way back, only through. Vaelor moved fast. Not fast enough. 3 days. That was all he had. 3 days between the moment Seraphine handed him the account codes and the moment the world caved in. 3 days of shadow work, of Drake's people pulling financial threads in the imperial treasury while the official audit plodded forward like a blind horse on a road that led nowhere. 3 days of Lucien smiling at council sessions, pouring wine at dinners, placing his hand on Vaelor's shoulder with the easy warmth of a man whose conscience was a clean, well-lit room with nothing hidden under the floorboards. 3 days of Vaelor watching his cousin and feeling the ground shift beneath his feet with every hour that passed. The account codes were real. Drakey's contact inside the treasury, a junior archivist named Tavin, who owed his career to the commander and feared the regent's office enough to work only between midnight and dawn, confirmed 7 of the 17 within 48 hours. Shell accounts layered inside legitimate trade funds. Revenue streams that originated in Voss's southern territories and disappeared into financial structures so deeply embedded in the imperial ledger that unraveling them would require dismantling half the treasury's architecture, and every single one of them carried the regent's seal, not a forged seal, not a copied seal. The authentic cryptographic imprint that only Lucien Thorne possessed, encoded into the Empire's financial system when he assumed the regency 11 years ago. Tavin delivered the confirmation in a sealed pouch, passed hand to hand through 3 intermediaries, and left in a hollowed brick behind the citadel's eastern chapel. Drake brought it to Vaelor at 2 in the morning, and they stood in the war chamber reading the numbers by the light of a single candle while the rest of the palace slept, and the silence between them was the silence of 2 men standing at the edge of a chasm they had always suspected was there, but had never looked down into. 7 confirmed, Drake said. 7 out of 17, and each one connects directly to payments that match the timeline of documented disappearances in the southern provinces. Money flowing in when people stop existing, like they were sold. Vaelor stared at the numbers. His hands were flat on the table, and beneath his palms the wood grain felt like something solid in a world that was losing its edges. The man he had trusted to manage his empire, the man who had stood at his right hand through a decade of governance, who had counseled him through crises and trade negotiations, and the endless political machinery that Vaelor despised and Lucien navigated like water through rock. The man who had called him cousin and meant it, or seemed to mean it, or had perfected the performance of meaning it so thoroughly that the difference no longer mattered. That man had been selling people, not directly, not with his own hands. Lucien's hands never touched anything that could stain them. But the money had passed through his seal, and the seal was the hand, and the hand was the man, and every layer of separation he had constructed between himself and the cargo in Voss's ships was nothing but architecture, beautifully designed, perfectly functional, and built on bodies. "We take this to council," Vaelor said. "We can't. Not yet. 7 accounts confirmed, 10 still unverified. Lucien's lawyers will shred a partial case. He will claim the seal was compromised. He will demand a review that takes months. He will... I know what he will do." "Then you know we need all 17. We need the roots. We need survivor testimony. We need a case so airtight that not even the best political operator in the Empire can wriggle free." "How long?" "A week, maybe 2, if Tavin can work without being discovered." "A week. 14 days of sitting across from Lucien at council sessions. 14 days of eating at the same table. 14 days of performing the role of the trusting cousin while the evidence of decades of monstrous betrayal accumulated in hidden pouches passed through hollowed bricks." Vaelor did not know if he could do it. Not because he lacked discipline. Discipline was the scaffolding that held his entire existence together, the structure that kept the isolation and the rage and the bone-deep exhaustion from collapsing into something that looked like a man falling apart in front of an empire that could not afford to see its king unravel. He did not know if he could do it, because every time he looked at Lucien now, he saw the faces of people he had never met. Omegas loaded onto ships in the dark, families erased from provincial records, human beings reduced to revenue streams in a ledger that bore his cousin's seal. And the fury that rose in him when those images surfaced was not the clean, directed anger of a battlefield. It was something murkier, something that tasted of shame, because the network had operated for years under his rule, inside his empire, and he had not seen it, had not wanted to see it, had trusted the man who made sure he never would. A king who does not see is not innocent, he is convenient. He pushed the thought down, not away, down, where it could sit and burn and fuel what needed to happen next. "A week," he said, "not 2. Tell Tavin to move faster." The ceremony came on the 4th day. Lucien announced it at council with the casual authority of a man proposing something so reasonable that opposition would look petty. The right of standing, an ancient tradition in which any individual brought under the crown's direct protection was required to present themselves before the imperial court, declare their identity, and submit to a formal assessment of their status and claims. It had not been invoked in decades. It was technically still law. "A formality," Lucien said, addressing the council with the warm, open expression of a man who wanted nothing more than transparency. "Our guest in the East Wing has been under the king's personal seal for 4 days now. The court is curious. Rumors circulate. A public presentation would put those rumors to rest and demonstrate that the crown has nothing to hide." Vaelor felt the trap close around him like jaws made of protocol. He could not refuse. Refusal would confirm the whispers already spreading through the court, that the king was hiding an Omega, that he was compromised, that his judgment had been clouded by a bond he could not control. The council would interpret refusal as admission. The noble houses would interpret it as weakness. And Lucien would interpret it as exactly the isolation he had been engineering since the moment Seraphine collapsed in the garden. He could not accept. Accepting meant exposing Seraphine to a court that Lucien had spent 11 years stacking with allies, dependents, and useful idiots. It meant placing her in a public arena where every word she spoke could be twisted, every reaction weaponized, every bruise on her body reframed as evidence of instability rather than abuse. The elegance of it was sickening. No matter which direction Vaelor moved, Lucien had already been there, had already shaped the ground, had already turned the king's own principles, transparency, accountability, the refusal to govern through secrecy, into the tools of his destruction. Agreed, Vaelor said, because there was no other word available. Tomorrow, full court. Lucien inclined his head. Vaelor did not look at Drake, did not need to. He could feel the commander's fury radiating from the base of the throne platform like heat from a forge, and he knew that the same calculation was running through both their minds. Lucien was accelerating. Something had changed. Something had made him decide that the slow game was no longer sufficient, that the careful, patient dismantling of Vaelor's position needed to happen faster. Either he knew about Tavin, or he knew about the account codes, or both. The night before the ceremony, Vaelor went to Seraphine. He found her standing in the middle of the room with a look on her face that he recognized because he had worn it himself, the expression of a person assembling armor out of nothing but will. She had pulled her hair back. Her bruises were fading but still visible, yellow-green ghosts of violence that no amount of clean linen could erase. Her hands were steady, her eyes were not. "He's going to try to break me in front of the court," she said. Not a question. "Yes. What do I need to know?" The right of standing allows any council member to challenge the claims of the person being presented. Lucien will have prepared questions designed to expose inconsistencies in your story. He will use the embezzlement document. He will frame your arrival here as infiltration rather than escape. And he will do it with enough courtesy that anyone watching will see a concerned regent protecting the crown, not a guilty man silencing a witness. And you cannot intervene. The king is required to remain neutral during the rite. If I defend you, it proves his narrative, that I am compromised, that you have influenced my judgment. So I stand alone. You stand alone. The words tasted like ash in his mouth. But you do not stand without preparation. Drake will be in the chamber, my allies on the council, Lord Ashburn, Lady Rienne. They know what Lucien is. They cannot speak directly, but they can steer questions, call procedural objections, buy you time if it turns hostile. If. A sound left her that was not quite a laugh. The ghost of one. The place where a laugh would live if the world permitted it. Vaelor. I spent 2 years inside a trafficking operation performing the role of a compliant Omega for men who would have killed me the moment I stopped being useful. A council chamber full of politicians in silk is not the thing that scares me. What scares you? She looked at him. The firelight caught her face and the shadows pooled in the hollows beneath her cheekbones. And for one moment, the mask she had built, the assessment, the calculation, the fierce and necessary armor of a survivor, slipped. Just a fraction. Just enough to show what lived underneath. That it won't be enough. That I will stand in front of that court and tell the truth, and it will not matter. Because the truth has never mattered in rooms like that. What matters is who controls the story, and he has been controlling it longer than I have been alive. Vaelor crossed the distance between them, not fast, not slow. The way a man moves when he is making a decision with his body that his mind has not finished processing. He stopped close enough that her scent reached him. That damaged, defiant iron and wildflower scent that had been burning in the back of his awareness since the night she fell out of his storm. And he looked down at her and felt the full weight of what he was about to say. The truth matters to me, and I am still the king. For now. For now is enough. She held his gaze. Something passed between them that was not spoken and did not need to be. An agreement, a recognition, the silent compact of two people who understood that what was coming tomorrow could destroy them both and were choosing to face it together anyway. Not because they were brave, because the alternative was surrender, and neither of them had any left. He did not touch her. The distance between them was measured in inches and felt like miles, and was exactly the width of everything neither of them could afford to say. "Tomorrow," she said. "Tomorrow." He left. And in the corridor outside, the air felt colder than it should have, and the shadows felt deeper, and the palace felt less like a fortress and more like a mouth. The ceremony lasted 40 minutes. 40 minutes of Seraphine Vael standing in the center of the imperial court's marble floor, alone, unshielded, with 200 of the empire's most powerful people staring down at her from tiered seats, and Vaelor Thorne asking questions with the gentle precision of a man threading a needle through living tissue. She answered everything. The embezzlement charges. She dismantled them with the specific, granular detail of a records clerk who had spent 18 months memorizing the very system being used against her. The timestamps, the filing codes, the procedural impossibility of creating the documents she was accused of forging from a position she no longer held. She spoke clearly, without trembling, and the court listened with the particular attention that people give to someone who is either telling the truth or performing the most convincing lie they have ever witnessed. Lucien adapted. Of course he adapted. When direct discrediting failed, he shifted. Not to facts, but to implications. The nature of her arrival, the circumstances of her injuries, the convenient timing of her appearance inside the citadel during the very week that investigations into the southern provinces were being discussed. He built a picture not through statements, but through questions, each one a brushstroke adding shade to the portrait of a woman whose story was too perfect, too useful, too precisely aligned with the king's existing suspicions to be anything but manufactured. And then he unveiled the second document. Not the employment records. Something worse. A sealed order bearing the sigil of the previous emperor, Vaelor's predecessor, the man whose death had elevated Vaelor to the throne 15 years ago, authorizing a covert investigation into the Alpha bloodline. An investigation that, according to the document, had uncovered evidence linking Vaelor to his predecessor's death. The court erupted. Not with sound, with the absence of it. A silence so total that the creak of Lord Ashburn's chair as he leaned forward sounded like a gunshot. 200 faces turning from Seraphine to Vaelor. 200 calculations running simultaneously behind 200 pairs of eyes. Is this real? Can this be true? What does this mean for my house, my alliances, my survival? This document was recovered from the sealed archives during the routine assessment prompted by our guest's claims, Lucien said, and his voice carried the grave, reluctant weight of a man who wished he did not have to speak these words, but whose duty left him no choice. I present it not as accusation, but as evidence that demands formal review. The council must determine its authenticity, and until that determination is made, I move that the king's executive authority be suspended pending investigation. The vote was 17-10. Vaelor's authority was suspended. He sat on the Iron Throne and felt the power drain from it like blood from a wound, and the faces of the council members who had voted against him blurred into a single mass of calculation and cowardice, and the particular cruelty of people who abandon a leader not because they believe he is guilty, but because standing beside him has become more expensive than walking away. Drake was at his side within seconds, his hand on his blade, his body positioned between the king and the council like a wall made of loyalty and barely controlled rage. "This is a coup," Drake said, low enough that only Vaelor could hear. "This is procedure." Vaelor's voice was hollow, scraped clean. He did not need swords. He never needed swords. The court adjourned. Guards who had served Vaelor for years now stood at attention with their eyes fixed on the middle distance, awaiting orders from the regent's office. The throne room emptied in clusters, allies first, fleeing before association could cost them, then neutrals calculating new positions, then enemies savoring the victory they had not earned but would absolutely claim. Vaelor descended the throne platform for what might be the last time and walked toward the east wing. He found it empty. The room was clean, the bed made, the fire cold, no sign of struggle, no note. No evidence that Seraphine Vael had ever existed inside these walls except for one thing, a single sheet of paper left on the windowsill, held in place by a small river stone that had not been there before. He picked it up. The handwriting was not Seraphine's. It was a formal palace script, the kind used by the regent's administrative office. It read, "The Omega known as Seraphine Vael has voluntarily departed the imperial citadel, having concluded that her presence posed unacceptable risk to the crown. She leaves with gratitude for the king's hospitality and regret for any inconvenience caused by her claims, which she acknowledges were influenced by personal distress rather than verified evidence." Below it, in a different hand, hurried, pressed hard enough to dent the paper, 3 words that might have been written by a fingertip dipped in something dark. Not my choice. Vaelor stood in the empty room. The stone was cold in his palm. The paper trembled in his grip, not because his hands were shaking, but because his entire body had become a single sustained vibration. The frequency of a man whose world has just been disassembled around him with surgical precision while he watched and could not stop it. She was gone. The evidence was gone. His authority was gone. And the man who had taken all 3 was somewhere in this palace, adjusting his cuffs and preparing for the next phase of a plan that had been running for longer than Vaelor had been king. 20 years. Lucien had been building this for 20 years. And every moment of trust, every shared meal, every hand on the shoulder and word of counsel and perfectly timed intervention, all of it had been scaffolding, framework, the architecture of a betrayal so complete that its architect had needed a generation to construct it. Vaelor looked at the 3 words on the paper. Not my choice. Written in haste. Written in fear. Written by a woman who had been taken from this room by people acting under the regent's authority, while the king sat powerless on his own throne and could not reach her. He set the paper down. He set the stone on top of it. And he stood in the silence of the empty room and felt something inside him shift. Not break, not bend, but shift, the way tectonic plates shift before the surface of the earth tears open. The king who had ruled through discipline and tradition and the careful maintenance of a system he believed in despite its flaws. The king was not enough. Had never been enough. The system itself was the weapon being used against him. And every protocol he honored, every tradition he upheld, every chain of command he respected was another link in the cage that Lucien had built around him. To survive what was coming, he could not be the king they expected. He would have to become something they had never seen. Drake found him 20 minutes later, still standing in the empty room, and the look on Vaelor Thorne's face was one that the commander had only seen once before. At Karen, in the moment before the wall collapsed, and Vaelor stopped being a commander and became something older and more frightening, something that did not negotiate with the impossible but simply refused to accept its terms. "They took her," Vaelor said. "I know. Find her." "Vaelor, find her, and then find me proof that Lucien killed my predecessor." His eyes were pale and flat and empty of everything except the single burning point of certainty that remained when everything else had been stripped away. Because if he manufactured that document, it means the real document exists. And if the real document exists, it tells a different story. One he has spent 15 years making sure no one ever reads. "You're going to war with your own regent. I am going to war with the man who stole my empire while I sat on the throne and thanked him for his service." The candle on the windowsill guttered and died. In the darkness, the king's eyes did not close. Drake found her in 3 days. Not because the trail was easy, because Drake was the kind of man who did not sleep when someone he had sworn to protect was missing, and because 30 years of military intelligence work had given him a network that existed outside the palace's official channels. Old soldiers, retired scouts, harbor workers, and stable hands who owed him debts paid in loyalty rather than coin. The kind of people Lucien's polished machinery overlooked because they were invisible, beneath notice. The mortar between the stones that no architect ever thinks about until the wall starts to crack. She was in the Veldrin salt cellars, a converted warehouse on the southern docks that Duke Malrek Voss used as a transit point for goods that could not survive inspection. The same docks where, according to the shipping manifest Tavin had pulled from the Treasury archives, 17 cargo vessels had departed over the past 2 years carrying weight that did not correspond to any documented commodity. Human weight. Drakesey's people confirmed her location on the 3rd night. 2 guards outside, 4 inside. Professional. Not Voss's provincial muscle, but trained operatives, the kind of men who worked contracts and asked no questions because questions reduced profit margins. Seraphine was alive, contained in a sub-level storage room with no windows, no ventilation, and a single door that locked from the outside. The information reached Vaelor through the same network of intermediaries and hollowed bricks that had carried the account codes. He read it standing in the war chamber that was no longer officially his authority suspended, his seal revoked, his access to the Imperial Guard redirected through the Regent's office by a council vote that had transformed him from king to prisoner in everything but name. The guards outside his door answered to Lucien now. The servants who brought his meals reported to Lucien's secretary. The corridors he walked were watched by eyes that tracked his movements and catalogued his meetings and fed every detail back to the man who had spent 20 years building the cage that Vaelor was only now learning to see. He read Drake's message and burned it. Then he did something that no one in the palace expected because it violated every protocol, every tradition, and every assumption that the imperial court held about the kind of man Vaelor Thorne was. He left, not through the main gates, not with an escort, not with the formal procession that accompanied every royal movement through the capital. He left through the same collapsed siege tunnels that Seraphine had used to enter the citadel, passages he had ordered mapped after her arrival, passages that wound through the guts of the ancient stone like veins through a body, too narrow for armor, too dark for torches, navigable only by a man willing to crawl on his hands and knees through centuries of dust and silence, with nothing but a short blade, and the kind of desperate, focused fury that makes a human being capable of things that would terrify them under calmer circumstances. He emerged on the eastern slope of the Citadel Hill at 2 a.m, covered in grime and limestone dust, his hands scraped raw from the stone. Drake was waiting with 3 horses and 2 men, Sergeant Cale and Corporal Venn, both Karen veterans, both men who had watched Vaelor hold a collapsing wall and had decided in that moment that whatever this man asked of them for the rest of their lives, the answer was yes. "You look like you crawled out of a grave," Drake said. "Close enough?" Vaelor took the reins of the nearest horse. His arms were shaking, not from fear but from the sustained physical effort of dragging himself through tunnels that had not been designed for a man his size, and from the deeper tremor that comes when a body has been running on will instead of sleep for 3 days and is beginning to present the bill. "How far?" 4 hours at pace. We hit the docks before dawn if we don't stop." "Then we don't stop." They rode south through the dark. The landscape unrolled beneath the horses' hooves, farmland first, then scrubland, then the coastal lowlands where the air thickened with salt and the smell of tide-exposed rock. Vaelor rode without speaking, and his silence was not the composed, strategic quiet of a king managing his emotions. It was the silence of a man who had stripped everything away. Title, authority, protocol, the entire apparatus of governance that had defined his existence for 15 years, and found underneath it something raw and unfinished and terrifyingly simple. He was going to get her back, not because she was evidence, not because she was a witness, not because her testimony could bring down Lucien and dismantle the network and restore the authority that had been stolen from him in a council chamber by a man who wielded procedure the way other men wielded swords. He was going to get her back because she had looked at him in a storm-soaked garden and seen the man instead of the crown, because she had walked through 2 years of captivity and emerged carrying truth instead of surrender. Because when she stood alone in front of 200 hostile faces and Lucien Thorne's surgical questioning, she had not broken, had not bent, had stood on the marble floor of the imperial court with her bruises showing and her voice steady, and had refused to let the people who had destroyed her life rewrite the story of what they had done. And because someone had written 3 words on a piece of paper, "Not my choice," and those words had cracked something open inside him that all the discipline and isolation and iron control in the world could not close again. A man who has nothing left to protect is dangerous because he has nothing to lose. A man who has found the thing worth protecting after years of having nothing, that man is something else entirely. That man will crawl through collapsed tunnels and ride through darkness and walk into a building full of armed men with nothing but a short blade and the absolute unshakable certainty that the person inside is coming out alive or he is not coming out at all. They reached Veldrin before the sky started to lighten. The salt cellars sat at the end of a stone pier that jutted into the harbor like a broken finger. The building was old, thick walls, iron-reinforced doors, the kind of construction designed to keep the sea out and its contents in. 2 guards stood at the entrance, visible in the light of a single lantern, professional, alert, armed with short swords and the casual readiness of men accustomed to violence as a work condition. Drake dismounted first, 4 inside, 2 on the sub-level door, the others rotating between the upper floor and the loading dock. Entry points: front door, loading dock on the harbor side, and a drainage channel underneath the foundation. Tidal access, narrow, but passable at low tide. Drake checked the sky. Tide's been out for 2 hours. We have maybe 1 hour before the channel floods. Then we go underneath. You are the king of the largest empire in the known world, and you are about to crawl through a drainage pipe. I am a man going to get someone back. The king can catch up later. Kael and Ven took the front. Not a direct assault, a diversion. A controlled disturbance at the main entrance designed to pull the upper floor guards toward the door and away from the sub-level access. Drake and Vaelor went into the water. The drainage channel was exactly as bad as it sounded, chest deep in places, shoulder width, reeking of brine and rot, and the particular organic decay that accumulates in structures built over tidal flats. The water was cold enough to make Vaelor's lungs seize on the first immersion, and he forced himself forward through the grip of it, his hands finding the slimy walls in the blackness, his breath coming in controlled bursts that echoed off the stone in a way that made the darkness feel alive. Drake moved beside him. Neither spoke. The only sounds were the slosh of water against stone and the distant, muffled thud of Kael hitting the front entrance with enough force to sound like trouble without being enough to trigger lethal response. They emerged in the sublevel through a floor grate that Drake pried loose with a blade and upper body strength that had no business existing in a man his age. The room above the grate was dark, empty, smelling of salt and old iron. They pulled themselves onto the stone floor and crouched in the shadows, dripping, breathing hard, listening. Footsteps above. 2 sets running toward the front of the building. The diversion was working, 1 set remaining. Stationary, just beyond the door at the far end of the room. Drake pointed at himself, then at the door. Vaelor shook his head. He moved first. The guard on the other side of the door was good. Not good enough. Vaelor came through the doorway low and fast with the short blade angled upward, and the guard managed to get his weapon half drawn before Vaelor's free hand locked around his wrist and twisted, and the sound of steel hitting stone was followed by the sound of a body hitting the wall, and then the sound of a man deciding very quickly that the contract he had been hired for was not worth dying over. Where is she? The guard's eyes were wide, not with the casual alertness of a professional, with the primal, gut-level recognition of something that could not be bargained with. Vaelor's face was inches from his, and what the guard saw there was not a king, not a politician, not the careful, controlled ruler that the Empire knew and feared from a comfortable distance. What the guard saw was the man who had held the wall at Karen. End of the hall, iron door, key is on the hook by the... Vaelor released him. The guard slid down the wall and stayed there, making no attempt to stand, making no attempt to reach for his weapon, making no attempt to do anything except breathe and be grateful that breathing was still an option. The key was where the guard said it would be. The iron door was heavy, the kind of heavy that spoke of a room built to contain things that wanted very badly to leave. Vaelor turned the key and pulled the door open, and the smell hit him first. Stale air, damp stone, human sweat, and underneath it all, the faint, damaged iron and wildflower scent that he would have recognized in a room full of 1,000 people. She was on the floor, not collapsed, sitting, her back against the far wall, her knees drawn up, her bandaged hands resting on her thighs. The bruises that had been fading were fresh again, new marks layered over old, a violence refreshed, a message rewritten on her body in the language that the people who had taken her understood best. Her lip was split. Her left eye was swelling shut, but her right eye was open. And when Vaelor stepped through the door, dripping seawater and limestone dust and smelling of tidal muck and sweat and the sharp metallic edge of a man who had just put another man into a wall, she looked at him with that eye, and something crossed her face that he had never seen before. Not relief, not gratitude, not the performed emotion of a rescued captive meeting her rescuer. Recognition. The deep cellular bone marrow recognition of one survivor looking at another and understanding, without words, that the person standing in the doorway had destroyed pieces of himself to get here and would destroy more if necessary, and was not asking for thanks or acknowledgement or any of the things that rescuers in stories expect. "You crawled through a drain," she said. "I crawled through 2 drains." Something happened to her face. A crack. A fracture in the armor she had rebuilt around herself during however many hours she had spent in this room, waiting for whatever came next. It was not a smile. It was the space where a smile would be if the world had earned one. "You are a very strange king." "So I have been told." He crossed the room and knelt beside her, and his hands, scraped, bleeding, shaking with cold and adrenaline, reached for her face with a gentleness that did not match anything else about him. His fingers stopped just short of the fresh bruise around her eye. "Can you move?" "I can move." "Can you fight?" The crack in her expression widened. Something fierce and bright climbed up through it. The same thing he had seen in the garden, in the East Wing, in front of the imperial court. The thing that had survived everything they had done to her and was still alive and burning and refusing to accept the terms of its own destruction. "Give me a weapon and find out." He handed her the short blade. She took it. Drake appeared in the doorway. "We have company." Kyle signals 3 additional men approaching from the harbor road. Voss's people. Someone tipped them. "How long?" "Minutes. The drainage channel is flooding. We go out the front or we don't go out." Vaelor looked at Seraphine. She was already on her feet, swaying, unsteady, but vertical, the blade in her hand held with the grip of someone who had been trained to use one and had not forgotten despite everything that had been done to the rest of her. He saw the decision in her eyes before she spoke it. Not the decision to fight. The decision that had been made long before this room, long before the garden, long before the first blow landed and the first document was forged and the first human being was loaded onto a ship and filed under the wrong column in a ledger. The decision to stop surviving and start ending it. "The Ascension Feast," she said, 3 days from now. "What about it?" "That is where Lucien will make his final move. The feast is the largest gathering of the nobility in the imperial calendar. Every major house, every council member, full court, full ceremony, no private meetings, and no closed doors." Her voice was gaining strength, not volume, but density, the compression of a mind that had been holding information under pressure and was now releasing it with precision. "I did not tell you everything. In the archives, before they took me, I found records that go back 15 years. Lucien did not just build a trafficking network. He engineered the succession. Your predecessor did not die of illness. He was poisoned, and the compound used was purchased through the same shell accounts that fund Voss's operation." The room went still. Seawater dripped from Vaelor's clothes onto the stone floor, and each drop sounded like a detonation in the silence. "You have proof." "I have the purchase records, the compound name, the date of acquisition, and I have the name of the physician who administered it, a man who currently serves on Lucien's private medical staff." She met his eye. "I memorized it, all of it. They can take every document, burn every archive, destroy every piece of physical evidence in the Empire. It does not matter. The proof is in my head, and the only way to get it out is to let me stand in front of that court one more time. Lucien will try to kill you. Lucien will try to kill both of us. He has been trying for years. The difference is that now we know the shape of the blade." Drake's voice came sharp from the hallway. "We need to move. Now!" Vaelor stood. Seraphine stood beside him, and the space between them was no longer inches. It was nothing. Her shoulder touched his arm. The blade in her hand caught the faint light from the corridor, and the light reflected in her one good eye, and for one moment, just one, stolen from the chaos and the urgency and the sound of men approaching through the harbor dark, they stood together in the room where they had meant to break her and felt the combined weight of what they were about to do. Walk back into the heart of the Empire. Confront the man who had built their destruction like an architect builds a cathedral, with patience, with precision, with the absolute conviction that the structure would stand forever. And tear it down. "Move," Vaelor said. They moved. Out of the cell, down the corridor, past the guards still sitting against the wall, through the front entrance where Kyle and Ven held positions with blades drawn and eyes tracking the harbor road, into the cold pre-dawn air that tasted of salt and coming rain and the particular electricity that precedes something that cannot be taken back. They mounted. They rode, and behind them, the salt cellars sat empty in the gray light, and the drainage channel flooded, and the iron door stood open like a mouth that had tried to swallow something it could not keep down. 3 days. 3 days to prepare for the Ascension Feast. 3 days to assemble allies, position evidence, and walk into the most public gathering in the Empire carrying enough truth to destroy the most powerful man in Varenth. 3 days during which Lucian would be doing exactly the same thing, preparing, positioning, engineering the final stroke of a plan that had consumed 2 decades of his life and the lives of more people than anyone would ever be able to count. Vaelor did not return to the Citadel. He could not. The moment Lucian discovered the salt cellar was empty, the palace would become the most dangerous place in the Empire for anyone carrying the king's face and the knowledge of what the regent had done. Instead, they went to ground. Drake's network providing safe houses, supply lines, and communication channels that operated entirely outside the palace's official infrastructure. For 3 days, Vaelor Thorne lived like the people his empire had failed, in cramped rooms above taverns, in borrowed clothes, eating food prepared by hands that did not know they were feeding a king and would not have cared if they did. And in those 3 days, stripped of every trapping of power, every symbol of authority, every physical reminder that he was the ruler of the largest dominion in the known world, he discovered something that the throne had hidden from him for 15 years. He was not the Empire. The Empire was not him. And the man who existed underneath the crown, scarred, exhausted, furious, terrified, and more alive than he had felt in years, that man was enough, had always been enough. The Ascension Feast began at sundown. The great hall of the Imperial Palace blazed with 1,000 lights. Oil lamps, crystal chandeliers, fire bowls set into the walls at intervals that turned the marble columns into pillars of gold. Every noble house was represented, every council member present. The long tables groaned with food and wine, and the air was thick with perfume and ambition, and the particular electricity of a gathering where everyone suspects something is about to happen and no one knows what. Lucian presided from the head table. Seated not on the throne, even he was not brazen enough for that, not yet, but in the regent's chair, elevated, central, commanding the room with the easy authority of a man who had been running the Empire in everything but name for longer than most of the people in this hall realized. He looked calm, composed. The silk coat was immaculate. The silver cuffs caught the lamplight. The smile was in place. The doors at the far end of the great hall opened. Vaelor Thorne walked in. Not through the royal entrance, through the main doors, the ones used by servants and minor officials and people who did not matter enough to warrant a private corridor. He walked in wearing no armor, no crown, no formal regalia, just the scarred, battered, road-worn appearance of a man who had spent 3 days living outside his own palace and had come back not to reclaim a throne, but to deliver a reckoning. Seraphine walked beside him. The hall went silent. Not gradually, instantly. The kind of silence that has physical properties, that presses against the eardrums and makes the heartbeat audible inside the skull. 500 faces turning, 500 calculations beginning, 500 people recognizing that the equation of power in this room had just changed in ways that could not be walked back. Lucian's smile did not falter, but his hand, his left hand resting on the table beside his wine glass, went still. Perfectly, completely still. The kind of stillness that a man's body produces when every ounce of his control is being redirected from appearance to assessment, from performance to survival. "Cousin," Lucian said, his voice carried across the silent hall with the warm, measured tone that had shaped the Empire's politics for 20 years. "We were concerned. Your absence was noted." "I imagine it was." Vaelor stopped in the center of the hall. The lamplight caught the scars on his face and the scrapes on his hands and the dried salt stains on his clothes, and he looked nothing like a king and everything like the thing that kings are supposed to be before the crown, and the protocol and the layers of performance turned them into something else. A man, standing in a room, telling the truth. Seraphine stepped forward, and Lucien's left hand moved, not to a weapon, not to a bell, not to any visible signal, but beneath the table, where his fingers found the edge of a small glass vial that had been placed there hours ago, nestled against the underside of the wood with a strip of wax that only he knew about. The vial contained enough concentrated etherbane to stop the hearts of every person within 15 feet of the head table. He had always known it might come to this. He had always been prepared to burn the room if the room turned against him. Seraphine opened her mouth to speak. Lucien's fingers closed around the vial, and the great hall of the imperial palace held its breath. Seraphine's voice filled the great hall the way water fills a crack in stone, finding every gap, every silence, every space where the truth had been kept out for 20 years and flooding it. She did not shout, did not perform. She stood in the center of that blazing hall with her bruised face and her one swollen eye and her borrowed clothes, and she spoke with the flat, precise diction of a records clerk reading entries from a ledger, and the effect was more devastating than any accusation delivered at volume could have been. Because volume can be dismissed as hysteria, precision cannot. Account Series 7 through 11, routed through the Veldrin Harbor Authority under the trade classification of mineral salts. Actual cargo, human beings, omegas and betas sourced from eastern and southern provincial territories through a network of coerced recruiters operating under Duke Malrek Voss's direct authority. She recited the account codes from memory, all 17, the dates of activation, the amounts transferred, the shell companies that existed only as names on documents filed in the Imperial Treasury under the Regent's cryptographic seal. Each account activated between the 6th and 11th year of the current Regency, each one bearing the authorization imprint assigned exclusively to Crown Regent Vaelor Thorne. The hall was a held breath. 500 people motionless in their seats, their food untouched, their wine forgotten, their faces caught between horror and the rapid political calculation of what this information meant for their own survival. Lucien's fingers tightened on the vial beneath the table. On the matter of the previous emperor's death, Seraphine's voice did not waver, did not accelerate. She delivered each word with the same measured weight, and each word landed in the silence like a stone dropped into still water. The imperial medical records list the cause as acute organ failure consistent with hereditary blood disease. The actual cause was etherbane poisoning, a compound purchased through Account Series 3, 17 months before the emperor's death, in a quantity sufficient for a single lethal dose. The purchase was authorized by the Regent's seal. The compound was administered by Dr. Edris Maven, currently serving on the Regent's private medical staff, over a period of 6 weeks through the Emperor's evening medication. Lucien stood. The motion was smooth, controlled, carrying none of the panic that should have accompanied the systematic demolition of a 20-year conspiracy. He stood the way he did everything, with precision, with composure, with the absolute mastery of surface that had made him the most effective political operator the Empire had ever produced. "This is a desperate performance by a desperate woman," he said, and his voice was warm, concerned, carrying the particular sadness of a man watching something regrettable unfold. A convicted embezzler, expelled from her position for fraud, now delivering memorized accusations without a single piece of physical evidence to support them. The council suspended the king's authority based on documented concerns. This is theater designed to shut documented concerns. Vaelor's voice came from behind Seraphine, and it was not loud, but it carried the particular quality that made every other sound in the room irrelevant. He stepped forward until he stood beside her, and in his hand he held a leather folio that Drake had assembled during 3 days of shadow work. Not a complete case, not all 17 accounts verified, but enough. 7 confirmed accounts. 3 witness statements from Treasury clerks who had processed transactions they knew were wrong and had lived in fear of the Regent's office ever since. An assigned affidavit from Tavin, the junior archivist, detailing the financial architecture of the entire network, with the granular specificity of a man who had decided that the risk of speaking was finally less terrifying than the cost of silence. Vaelor laid the folio on the nearest table. Open. Visible. The documents fanning out across the white linen like a wound being exposed to air for the first time. Physical evidence, Vaelor said. 7 accounts confirmed, 3 witnesses prepared to testify, and the signed cooperation of a Treasury official who has documented every transaction your seal authorized for the past 11 years. He looked at his cousin across the length of the hall, and the lamplight caught the scars on his face and the exhaustion in his eyes, and the particular stillness of a man who has arrived at the moment he has been moving toward his entire life without knowing it. You built this, Lucien, every layer, every safeguard, every misdirection. You built it the way you build everything, perfectly. And it is over. Lucien looked at the folio, looked at Seraphine, looked at the 500 faces staring at him from the tiered seats with the dawning, irreversible recognition that the man they had trusted with the Empire's governance had been hollowing it out from the inside for 2 decades. His hand moved beneath the table. Drakey saw it. The commander had been positioned at the edge of the hall, invisible among the servants and minor officials who lined the walls, and he had been watching Lucien's hand since the moment Vaelor walked through the doors. 30 years of military intelligence, 30 years of reading the body language of men who were about to do something violent. He saw the shift in Lucien's shoulder, the subtle rotation of the wrist, the way the regent's weight transferred to his left side as his fingers closed around something small enough to conceal in a palm. Drake moved. He covered the distance between the wall and the head table in 4 strides that made no sound on the marble floor, and his hand locked around Lucien's wrist before the vial cleared the edge of the table. The grip was iron, the kind of grip that does not negotiate. Lucien's fingers spasmed, and the vial, small, glass, filled with a liquid the color of weak tea, tumbled from his grasp and shattered on the stone floor. The smell that rose from the broken glass was faint, sweet, almost pleasant, and every person within 10 feet of it instinctively stepped back, because something in the human animal recognizes poison even when the mind has never encountered it. A primal, wordless alarm that fires in the gut before the brain has time to name what it is sensing. Etherbane, Drake said, loud enough for the hall to hear. The same compound she just described. The same compound that killed the Emperor. He held Lucien's wrist above the table, the regent's fingers still curled around nothing, and the hall saw it. The regent of the Empire, the most trusted man in Varenth, caught with the murder weapon in his hand at the very moment its existence was being exposed. The silence that followed was not the held-breath silence of anticipation. It was the silence of something ending. The sound a structure makes in the fraction of a second after the last support gives way, and before the collapse begins, that impossible, suspended moment when the building is still standing, but everyone inside it knows it is already falling. Lucien looked at Vaelor, and the mask came off. Not gradually, not in pieces. All at once, like a curtain dropping, and what lived behind it was something that the court had never seen because Lucien had spent 20 years making sure they never would. Cold, bright, utterly, completely lucid. The face of a man who had built an empire within an empire, who had moved people like pieces on a board and erased them when they were no longer useful, and who had done all of it not out of madness or cruelty, but out of the calm, considered conviction that he was the only person in Varenth intelligent enough to deserve the power he had taken. You want to know the truth, cousin? Lucien's voice was different now. Stripped of warmth, stripped of performance, clean and sharp as a surgical instrument. The truth is that I saved this empire. While you were bleeding on battlefields and collecting scars to prove how noble you were, I was holding together a political structure so fragile that one wrong council vote could have shattered it into civil war. I built the alliances, I managed the lords, I buried the threats that would have consumed you. And yes, I removed the old emperor, because he was weak, because his weakness was a disease that would have killed every person in this hall, because someone had to make the decision that no king ever wants to make, and I made it. And I would make it again. The words fell into the hall like bodies falling from a height, and every person who heard them understood that this was not a defense. It was a confession, delivered without shame, without regret, without any of the human markers that separate a man who has done terrible things from a man who has become them. Lucian Toursaminian's gaze swept the room. You want to judge me. Every one of you. You want to sit in your seats and clutch your wine and tell yourselves that you are different, that you would have chosen differently. But you would not. Because every one of you has benefited from what I built. Every trade agreement, every stable border, every peaceful succession, all of it resting on foundations that I laid with my own hands, while you looked the other way and enjoyed the results. And the people in the ships, Seraphine's voice cut through his like a blade through silk. Quiet, devastatingly precise. The Omegas sold through your accounts. The families erased from provincial records. Were they foundations too? Lucien looked at her, and for the first time something flickered behind the cold clarity of his expression. Not guilt, not remorse, but the faintest shadow of something that might have been recognition. The recognition that the woman standing in front of him was the one variable his architecture had not accounted for, the one stone in the foundation that had refused to stay where he placed it. Necessary costs, he said. Every empire has them. Not this one, Vaelor stepped forward. Not anymore. Lucian's hand went to his sword. The movement was fast, faster than anyone expected from a man who had spent his life behind desks and council tables. The blade cleared the scabbard with a sound that rang through the hall like a bell, and 500 people surged back from the center of the room in a wave of silk and panic. And for one moment, the great hall of the imperial palace contracted to a single point. 2 men standing 10 feet apart, one armed with a sword and the remains of a shattered mask, the other armed with nothing but the folio of evidence and the scars that proved he had earned every inch of the ground he stood on. Kael and Ven moved from the flanks. Drake drew his blade. Guards who had been standing at the walls, some loyal to the regent, some to the crown, none certain anymore which was which, reached for their weapons and froze, caught between conflicting orders and the paralyzing awareness that drawing a sword in this moment meant choosing a side from which there was no return. Put it down, Lucien. Or what? You will kill me. Lucien's blade was steady, his breathing was controlled, and his eyes held the terrifying calm of a man who has run out of moves and has decided that the last one will be the one that defines him. That is what they want, Vaelor. Every person in this room. They want the Alpha King to do what Alpha Kings do. They want blood. They want the monster they have always believed you to be. I know what they want. Then give it to them. Be the thing they made you. Be the weapon. Be the beast on the throne that keeps the empire in line through fear. It is what you were built for. It is the only language this world understands. Vaelor looked at his cousin, looked past the sword and the confession and the 20 years of calculated betrayal, and saw, beneath all of it, the thing that Lucien would never admit and perhaps did not even know, that the architecture of his conspiracy had not been built on ambition alone. It had been built on the genuine, warped, self-destroying conviction that he was protecting something, that the empire was fragile, that power was the only medicine for fragility, and that the cost of administering it was a price that someone had to pay so that everyone else could sleep at night. He was wrong. Profoundly, catastrophically, irredeemably wrong. But the wrongness had started somewhere real, in the same fear that lived in every ruler, every protector, every person who had ever stood between the people they loved and the chaos that wanted to consume them. The fear that being good was not enough, that the world required something harder than goodness to survive. Vaelor had carried that fear his entire life. It had built his scars. It had built his isolation. It had built the iron throne he sat on, and the iron discipline he ruled with, and the iron distance he maintained from every person who tried to get close, because closeness was vulnerability, and vulnerability in the imperial court was an invitation to be destroyed. And he was done with it. Not because the fear was gone. It was not. It sat in his chest like a stone, and it would sit there for the rest of his life, because that was what fear did. It did not leave. It simply became something you carried instead of something that carried you. But he was done letting it make his decisions, done letting it choose the kind of man he was. done being the weapon that the world expected because the world had never been shown anything else.
No, Vaelor said. Lucien's blade did not move. I am not going to kill you. I am not going to be the thing you built me into. And I am not going to prove that the only answer to violence is more violence, because that is the lie you have been telling yourself for 20 years to justify every body you buried and every life you sold. He stepped forward. One step. Toward the blade. Toward the man holding it. Toward the end of something that had been building since the day a young regent looked at a young king and decided that power belonged to the one willing to do whatever it took. You will stand trial. You will face the people you harmed, and this empire will decide what justice looks like. Not because I command it, but because it is time for this empire to decide something for itself instead of having it decided by men who think they know better. Lucien's hand trembled. Just once. Just enough. The blade lowered. It clattered on the marble floor, and the sound it made was the sound of a reign ending. Not the reign of the king, but the reign of the shadow behind the king, the invisible architecture of control that had shaped every decision, every alliance, every quiet disappearance for 20 years. Drake's men took him, efficiently, without violence. Lucien walked between them with his back straight and his face empty and his hands at his sides, and he did not look back. The hall watched him go in a silence that was no longer held but released. The exhale of 500 people who had just witnessed the most powerful man in the empire stripped of everything he had built and walked out of the room he had controlled under the guard of men who answered to the king he had tried to destroy. The weeks that followed were not triumphant. They were necessary.
Duke Malric Voss was arrested at his southern estate 3 days after the feast. His trafficking network was dismantled port by port, route by route, account by account, with Tavin and the treasury clerks providing the financial roadmap and Drake's people following it to every endpoint. 47 survivors were recovered from transit points along the southern coast. 47 people who had been filed under the wrong column in a ledger and treated as cargo and were now standing in daylight for the first time in months or years, blinking at a world that had finally noticed they were missing. The council was reconstituted, not purged. Vaelor refused the wholesale removal that Drake advocated, understanding with the hard-won wisdom of a man who has seen the inside of his own failures that systems do not improve by being destroyed. They improve by being forced to confront what they allowed. 11 council members faced investigation for complicity or willful blindness. 6 were removed. The rest remained, carrying the weight of what they had permitted and the knowledge that the new empire would not allow them the luxury of looking away again. Vaelor reformed the law, not with grand proclamations or ceremonial signings, with specific structural changes that dismantled the legal framework enabling the treatment of omegas and betas as property rather than people. Coercive bonding statutes, abolished. Involuntary status classifications, abolished. The legal doctrine that an alpha's claim superseded an omega's choice, torn from the code with the methodical precision of a surgeon removing something that should never have been allowed to grow. It was not popular. Parts of it were actively resisted. Lords who had built their power on the old system fought every amendment with the desperate fury of men watching the foundations crack beneath their feet. Vaelor fought back, not with the iron authority that the old system would have provided, but with the grinding, unglamorous, endlessly frustrating work of building consensus among people who did not want to be convinced. It was slower. It was harder. It was nothing like the decisive, unilateral command that the Empire expected from its Alpha King. It was better. Seraphine did not stay. She stood in the courtyard on a morning 3 weeks after the feast, dressed in traveling clothes, carrying a single bag, and the bruises were gone, but the scars remained, visible and invisible, the kind that do not fade because they are not meant to. They are meant to be carried, worn, allowed to become part of the landscape of a person rather than hidden beneath the surface where they can fester. Vaelor found her there. He knew she was leaving. She had told him 2 days before, standing in the war chamber with the maps of the southern provinces still spread across the table and the evidence folios stacked in the corner like the remains of a building that had been torn down to make room for something that had not been built yet. The survivors in the South need someone who understands what they went through, she had said.
Someone who can look them in the eye and say, "I know," and mean it. I cannot do that from inside a palace. He had not argued, not because he did not want to,
Because he understood, with the kind of understanding that costs something, that requires a man to set down what he wants and pick up what is right and carry it even though it is heavier, that asking her to stay would be asking her to choose him over the thing that made her who she was. And a man who does that is not a man who loves. He is a man who collects. He stood in the courtyard with her. The morning light was clean, the kind of light that comes after long storms, when the sky has exhausted itself, and the air smells of washed stone and new growth, and the particular freshness that the world produces when it is trying to start over. "How long?" he said. "I don't know. Months, maybe longer. There are 47 people who need to rebuild lives that were taken from them, and the infrastructure for that does not exist yet. It needs to be built, and I need to be the one who builds it. I could send resources, people, funding. You could, and I will ask for it, but not from inside these walls." She looked up at him, and her dark eyes held something that had not been there before. Not the assessment, not the calculation, not the fierce survivalist armor that had kept her alive through 2 years of captivity and a political war that had nearly consumed them both. Something quieter. Something that existed on the other side of survival, in the territory that opens up when a person has been through the worst and discovered that the worst did not win. "I need to know who I am when I am not fighting," she said. "I have been fighting since the day they took me, fighting to survive, fighting to remember, fighting to get here. And now that the fight is over, I do not know what is left. I need to find out. And I need to do it somewhere that is not defined by what happened to me inside these walls." Vaelor looked at her, and the thing he felt was not loss, not yet, that would come later, in the quiet hours when the palace was empty and the scent of iron and wildflowers was a memory that lived in his chest like an ember that would not cool. What he felt was respect, the specific, bone-deep respect of a man looking at someone who is doing the hardest thing a survivor can do, choosing to heal instead of choosing to be needed. "When you come back," he said, and it was not a question. "When I come back." And it was not a promise, it was a fact, stated with the same flat precision that had dismantled Lucien's conspiracy in front of 500 witnesses, a fact that did not need to be dressed in ceremony or sealed with vows. It simply was. "It will not be because I owe you, or because duty requires it, or because the empire expects a king to have a queen. I know. It will be because I choose it, because I have seen who you are without the crown and without the power and without the iron discipline that you use to keep the world at arm's length. And the man underneath all of that is someone I want to stand beside. Not behind, not beneath. Beside." Vaelor's hands were at his sides. His scarred fingers opened and closed once, the only external sign of the magnitude of what was happening inside him. The king who had held a collapsing wall, the man who had crawled through drainage tunnels, the ruler who had stood in front of a drawn sword and chosen justice over violence, all of those versions of himself, and none of them had prepared him for this, for the experience of being seen completely by another person and discovered to be enough. "Beside," he said. She touched his hand, brief, deliberate, her fingers against his scarred knuckles for 3 seconds, long enough to mean everything, short enough to be the beginning of something rather than the continuation of what had come before. Then she picked up her bag, walked across the courtyard, mounted the horse that Drake had prepared, and rode south through the palace gates without looking back, because looking back was something you did when you were afraid of losing what you were leaving. She was not afraid. Vaelor stood in the courtyard after she was gone. The morning light fell on the stone where she had stood, and the shadow of the palace gate stretched long across the ground, and somewhere in the distance a bird sang the kind of note that exists in the space between endings and beginnings, not triumphant, not mournful, just alive. He stood there for a long time. Then he turned and walked back into the palace, back into the work, back into the daily, grinding, unglamorous labor of rebuilding an empire that had been rotting from the inside for 20 years and was only now beginning to grow new tissue over the wounds. He did not sit on the Iron Throne that day. He had it moved to the lower hall, where the light was better, and the distance between the seat and the people standing before it was shorter. It was a small thing, a gesture. But gestures are how empires change, not in single, dramatic moments of confrontation, but in the 1,000 small decisions that follow, each one a choice between what has always been done and what could be done instead. Seraphine came back 7 months later. Not announced, not ceremonial. She walked through the same courtyard on a morning that smelled of rain, carrying the same bag, wearing the marks of 7 months of work that had been harder and more important than anything she had ever done. She had built shelters, organized survivor networks, testified before provincial courts, held the hands of people who were learning to sleep without fear for the first time in years. She had also learned who she was when she was not fighting, and the answer had surprised her. Not because it was dramatic, but because it was simple. She was someone who chose, who looked at the world with clear eyes and chose what to stand for and who to stand beside, and what kind of life was worth building in the wreckage of everything that had tried to destroy her. Vaelor was in the courtyard when she arrived, not waiting, working, reviewing dispatches with Drake, the two of them standing over a table dragged into the open air because Vaelor had discovered, during his 3 days outside the palace, that he thought better under open sky than under marble ceilings. He looked up when the gate opened, saw her, and the expression that crossed his face was not surprise, because he had known she would come back the same way he knew the sun would rise, not because it was promised, but because it was true. He walked toward her, she walked toward him. They met in the center of the courtyard, in the same spot where a storm had brought a wounded woman into a king's garden and started something that neither of them had been prepared for, and both of them had been waiting for without knowing it. He did not offer her a crown, did not offer her a title, did not offer her anything that belonged to the empire rather than to the man. "Stay," he said. One word. Carrying the weight of everything he had learned in 7 months of ruling alone, and discovering that alone was no longer a condition he was willing to accept. Not because he could not function without her. He could. He had. But functioning and living are different things, and the difference is the presence of someone who sees you without the armor and does not look away. "I already am," she said. They stood in the courtyard. The morning light was clean. The palace was imperfect and scarred and full of work that would take years to complete. The empire was changing, slowly, painfully, with resistance and setbacks, and the 1,000 small failures that accompany any attempt to make something better than it was. And in the center of it, two people who had found each other in a storm and lost each other in a conspiracy and fought their way back to the same courtyard on the same kind of morning. They stood together. Not as king and subject, not as alpha and omega, not as the roles the world had built for them, as equals, choosing each other in daylight, without conditions. The empire would remember Vaelor Thorne as the king who conquered armies and survived betrayal and reformed the laws that had governed his world for generations. History would remember him as the man who stood in a courtyard and said one word, and meant it,